You're listening to Refracted World with Terry Geo. Episode 22, The First Transgender Person. If you are a regular to my podcast, you'll know that last week's episode was all about the history of gay men, and today I'd like to do the same for trans people. Unfortunately, history is sparse when it comes to the LGBTQIA+ community, and what is there is usually focused on gay men. Or so I thought. It turns out there's actually a lot of evidence and records of trans people, although there is hardly any information on lesbians in antiquity. That isn't to say there isn't any. We do have the few snippets of recorded history to show that they did indeed exist, because of course they did. And when it comes to the transgender community, there is quite a lot of history to go through. But just how far back does that history go? Well, let's find out. The first thing we need to address is the term transgender itself. Like homo, hetero, bisexual, lesbian, these terms just didn't exist until the 1900s. And so when we look back into our collective histories, a modern lens is applied to someone that will not have used that term at that time. But through our records and research, we can ascertain the relevant information needed to make informed decisions. This is how all of ancient history is pieced together, as surviving accounts and records did not survive the passage of time. Our ancestors just didn't have the necessary tools to share information throughout millennia. Unless, of course, you're Egyptian. That's right, we're starting once again back with ancient Egypt. I know they wanted their words to stand the test of time, but I wonder if any of them truly believed we would be reading them thousands of years later. In 1200 BCE, so that's over 3,000 years ago, in the reign of Seti II, a story was written on papyrus, which is currently being housed in the British Museum. Of course it is. The tale of two brothers tells the story of Anubis and Bata. It's a very convoluted and often graphic and bloody tale. At one point, Bata cuts off his own penis and tells his wife, "I am a woman just like you." One modern scholar has suggested this makes them transgendered. But I don't actually agree. If you read the story in its entirety, it isn't about him becoming a woman, but actually proving to his brother that he is not a liar. Yes, it could be interpreted that Bata was temporarily trans, but in the same story, he also becomes a tree and finally is reincarnated as his former human self. It's a really weird story. That isn't to say that there were no trans people in ancient Egypt, it just means that we have no definitive record of them, and with a minority as small as the queer community, it's not really surprising. But there are signs of a possible trans person who once reigned over Egypt as one of the most successful pharaohs of all time. In the 1500s BCE, Hatshepsut was a female ruler who wore male attire and even donned a false beard from time to time. Was this done simply to fit in with the more commonly known male pharaohs, or was Hatshepsut transgender? As most of their legacy was literally chiselled out of history, we will likely never know for sure. I know quite a bit about Hatshepsut because they are amazing and have long been my favourite pharaoh, and I really do want to do an entire episode just about them. And maybe one day I'll do one. What we do know for sure is that elsewhere in Africa, many nations had transgender people happily living their lives in their communities. In Sudan, for instance, men who dressed as women were seen as transgender and could also marry men with no problems or issues at all. And they're not a one-off. The same thing happened in Kenya, where male priests would dress as women and could even marry men if they chose to. In South Sudan and Ethiopia, the Nuer people allowed childless widows to adopt a male status and marry a woman, to be regarded as the father of any children they bore. They also had male-to-female roles as well. In West Africa, the Igbo people had both a third gender and transgender roles. Women could take on a male status and marry women. There's even a modern documented case from 1991 of a transgender man who is the husband of two wives. He stated, "By creation I was meant to be a man, but as it happened, when coming into this world, I came with a woman's body. That is why I dress as a man." In Uganda, gay and trans people were largely accepted. The Lango people even wove it into their mythology and believed the trans women were transformed during conception by the androgynous deity Shok. I think that's how you pronounce it. They could also marry men if they chose to. From the 16th century, there are records of the Bantu peoples of southern Africa who had a third sex known as boy wives. These young men married or had relations with older men and sometimes dressed as women and did women's work. These relationships were widespread and were well accepted in the community, and that lasted until the 1950s. These boy wives were often interpreted as homosexual and or transgender. So with all this history of gay and transgender people throughout Africa, what on earth happened? Africa is now one of the most anti-LGBTQIA+ continents on the planet, and it's getting worse, not better. Uganda has increased its trans and homophobia in the past 20 years. It's already illegal there, but they've made the punishments even harsher. In Somalia, Nigeria, Sudan, and Mauritania, you will likely be killed for being queer, and more than half the continent has laws prohibiting anyone from the LGBTQIA+ community to simply be themselves. This year, Ghana passed a bill making anyone identifying as queer illegal. And of course, when you have all these anti-LGBTQIA+ laws, it causes far more hate crimes and violence and killings from the community, with people there living in constant fear of their lives and having no freedom to exist at all. How did Africa get this way? How could a continent so rich with history and acceptance of all people become one of the worst and most barbaric places on the planet? Well, to put it bluntly, we happened, as in the Westerners. Christianity spread around Europe like a plague, and not content with only poisoning all of our minds, we also had to go and poison every other country as well. Christian missionaries travelled around the globe, waving their book in hand and telling the native peoples that their way of life was wrong, and they needed to follow the teachings of the Bible. And now, decades and centuries later, that's exactly what's happened. They ignore their own history and the people living in their own countries in favour of a Western ideology that has no basis in reality. I commented on a video recently which was talking about the new anti-LGBTQIA+ law in Ghana. If passed, it would imprison anyone identifying as LGBT+ for up to 3 years, and the funding or forming of an LGBT-related group would be punished with up to 5 years in prison. They are making the same mistake as many other countries have in the past. They believe being gay is a choice, and if you stop people talking about it, it will go away. But anyone with a modicum of intelligence knows that isn't the case, as no one chooses their sexual orientation. The video discussed how the country is already in poverty, which is likely to get much worse over the next year. Ghana depends on its financial contributions from the rest of the world, but the World Bank has now said if this law is passed, they will lose billions of dollars in aid, like up to $6.5 billion. After watching the video, I left this comment. The country is starving and the government is corrupt, so they distract the people by demonizing an innocent minority. They're free to pass the law just as other countries are free not to fund it. I added that last line because so many of the comments were basically saying it's their country, they can do what they like. Although passed by the government, the bill has yet to be signed by the president. He is being told by his financial advisors not to sign it for obvious reasons. But if he does, it will financially cripple the already struggling country. And for what? Why would you do that to yourselves? Anyway, weeks after I left my comment, I received a response from someone in Ghana. The comment reads, No, we are not starving, people just don't want to have the same-sex marriage. So I responded, you want to deny people you don't know the right to love who they want to love and demonize a minority for being born with a different orientation as you. Disgusting. They came back with, yo bro, I'm currently in Ghana, there's a lot of gay lesbians here, 99% of people just don't want to see the same-sex marriage because it's against their cultures. Now, I got these messages while researching this episode, and so I replied with, no it's not. The history of Africa was very pro-LGBTQIA+. The only reason you're against it now is because of European Christians. Religion is a belief. Queer people are real and deserve equal rights. They didn't respond to my post, and it's been 4 days now. Because how could they? What I said was completely accurate, and as you've listened to this podcast, you also know it's true as well. But we're 11 minutes into this podcast, and I still haven't told you who the first recorded transgender person was. For that, we need to travel north to the Mediterranean and all the way back to 7,000 BCE, so 9,000 years ago. There are drawings from the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods depicting a third sex, a human figure with female breasts and male genitalia. This is so far back that it's closer to the beginning of human society than it is today, by a long shot. Human beings first started building small communities together around 12,000 years ago, meaning the human era calendar just adds 10,000 years to ours. I have a human era calendar downstairs, and so that means that we are actually living in 12,024 instead of 2024. Anyway, it also means that these drawings from all the way back 9,000 years ago are some of the first ever records from any human society. And this is one of the earliest known records of trans people ever depicted. So not only is this the first record of a trans person, it's also one of the first records of a human person, meaning that trans people and queer people go all the way back to the beginning of human civilization. In 2900 BCE, the burial of a person in the Czech Republic, who I mentioned in last week's episode, is thought to be either homosexual or a transgender person, as they were buried wearing women's clothes, with items usually reserved for women, and they were facing the opposite way to how the other men were buried, the way that women are usually buried. Back then, they were very meticulous about their burials, so it's highly unlikely that this was a mistake. Meaning that this queer person was respected not only in life, but also in death, which is nice to know. In pre-modern Muslim societies, there is considerable evidence for institutionalized cross-dressing and other cross-gender behavior amongst men and women. The eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire are sometimes viewed as and referred to as a third gender, and in Japan there is extensive evidence for transgender people during the Edo period of the 17th century. China also has its fair share of eunuchs, with records dating back 3,000 years. These were the imperial servants, starting with the Qing dynasty and going on all the way until about 100 years ago. These eunuchs have also been viewed as a third sex or transgender, although this raises some questions for me. Were these people actually transgender and wanted to become eunuchs, or were they slaves who were forced into that way of life? If it's the latter, then these are not transgender people and instead were forcibly mutilated against their will. So I did a little bit of research on this, and from what I found so far, it seems that on the whole, this was a consensual practice, but it seems that it was to gain power and status rather than being transgender. This may have been the motivation for some, if not all, but I would need to do a lot more research to find out. The problem is, as I stated at the beginning of this episode, is that the way we view sexuality and gender now is not the same throughout history, and finding a definitive answer may not even be possible. If any Chinese history scholars have researched this, please get in touch, as I would love to know more. I think for now, what we can say for sure is that it is possible that some of the eunuchs throughout history who chose to be eunuchs may have also been transgender. There are more eunuchs documented in 400 BCE. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, from the Hippocratic Oath fame, writes about the androgynous eunuch priests and healers who perform female work and speak like women. From there, records are better kept, and we have a plethora of information and confirmation of the transgender community from the 1st century CE all the way to modern day, like a lot. Being trans isn't a new fad. It has been around since human beings first evolved. What we have now, though, is a public speaking forum where trans people can present themselves to the world. And, as well as social media, medical science has also evolved. People born in the wrong body can these days change their physical appearance to match who they really are, if they so choose. For millennia, that wasn't even an option. But humans did what they could to live as authentic a life as they could. And, as we've seen, until the Christians came into play, these people were widely accepted in their communities. Today, much of the world have clamped down on these already barbaric laws, whereas others have broken their imperial chains. We talk about gay rights, but these are often LGBTQIA+ rights and laws. Wherever gay people have freedom, as a general rule, so do the rest of our community. Of course, for some, these anti-laws have thankfully never come into play. The Native Americans have long-standing names and roles for gender variant and third gender people. The term Two-Spirit was adopted in the 1990s and proves that you can happily coexist with people of all walks of life. Throughout Asia, there are many accounts of third gender and transgender people. We have records dating back 3,500 years, and still today they are legally recognised as third gender in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. Indonesia has an estimated 7 million transgender people living in the country right now, and Thailand is well known for having third and even fourth genders documented with records dating back over 2,000 years. Brazil has a similar history amongst their indigenous populations, until of course the Europeans invaded in the mid-18th century. It wasn't until 2010s when gender-affirming care was established, and yet in 2021, Brazil had the largest number of trans and queer people murdered than in any other country in the world, for the 13th consecutive year. When you put laws in place against a minority, it sows hate and discrimination into the minds of the population, who act on it in the most horrific ways. You are not protecting children with these laws, you are killing innocent people who were just born differently from the majority of people. Further south in the Americas, Argentina has been lauded as one of the most progressive countries for LGBTQIA+ laws, and in 2015, the World Health Organization cited Argentina as an exemplary country for providing transgender rights. Researching this episode, I have found records of trans people throughout history in every single country. Just like gay history I examined last week, trans and queer people were largely accepted in all communities. They were human beings who were just a little bit different from the rest. That was all. But then, just like with gay people, European Christians travelled the globe with their power ego, wealth and weapons, and forced almost every nation to adopt their way of life because only their way of life was the right way of life. And so, over the coming centuries of imperial rule, that's what happened. Many abandoned their gods, their shared history, and their communities to follow Christianity. And today, many of these countries force their way of life on everyone else, just like the Europeans did to them. If you're trans or gay or lesbian or bi or queer, you don't exist. And if you do, you will be punished, imprisoned, or killed by the government. You will be ostracized, abandoned, and tormented by your family and friends, and you will be abused and possibly even murdered by people in the streets, all because you were born different. If you grew up in a country like this, would you choose to be trans or queer knowing what would happen to you? No. And yet the millions of queer people that are living there right now in those countries, they know it isn't a choice. Because if it were, they would choose to be heteronormative and live a life without fear. Anti-LGBTQIA+ laws don't work because you can't stop someone being born queer. As we've learnt here today, trans and queer people have existed from the beginning of time and will continue to exist until the very end. No law or mass execution will stamp out queer life. And being trans or queer isn't a disease that can be spread. These laws target innocent minorities who cannot change who and what they are. By not educating people and explaining the truth, these countries condemn millions of people to live brutally short lives. Why? Why do this? Every human life is as important as the next. You are not more important than anyone else. So why should someone who is queer be subjected to such cruelty? Once again, I'm angry. I've spent 3 days putting together all of this research, and with this and last week's episode, I want to scream at the top of my lungs and cry into a pillow for hours on end simultaneously. How can any human being be so cruel and stupid to allow this to happen anywhere in the world? I will never understand it, and I will never stop talking about it. I hope you've learned something today. I've actually learned a lot. I didn't realise there was such a wealth of trans history at our fingertips. And yet there is. There's as much as gay history, as I've discovered doing these 2 episodes. And it's amazing and brilliant and also awful that we are now living in a world that is just so anti-queer. And I just hope that more people stand up and talk about this because it's important. It is so important. It isn't, like I said, it's not a disease that can spread. We are a very small minority that will keep being born over and over again because we don't get to choose this. We just want to live like everybody else. And all these countries that are putting anti-LGBTQIA+ laws in place and killing and abusing and torturing, why are you doing this? How can you not look at any kind of history and realise that this doesn't work? If it worked, there would be no queer people. Queer people wouldn't exist now if that worked. And it just hurts me so much that we have to go through this time and time again. And the only way to change it is through education. And the only way to educate people is by talking to them. And this is why my podcast exists. I try to educate whilst entertaining. It's what I do. And I just wish more people would do it. Because at the moment, the only people who are shouting it are the queer people. And unfortunately, we are a tiny minority. And so when we say anything, it doesn't really get heard, or it just gets abused. And we need more allies to stand up and say, this isn't right. So if you're listening to this, whether you're queer or not, please send it to anybody, everybody, share it everywhere. In fact, these past 2 episodes, please share everywhere because people need to know this. I have read out the history. I have given you a snapshot of history of queer and trans life throughout the past 9,000 years. And the thing is, you can listen to my podcast, you can Google it yourself, you can find all this information online. That's where I found it. My head doesn't have every single history in it. I had to look online to find it all. And it didn't take long. It's, you type in trans history and Wikipedia will come up with a page, and then you can go to other pages and find out the details of different things. It's not difficult to do. And we need more of this education. I mean, as you know from listening to my podcast before, there was no queer education when I was at school because it was illegal to talk about it in school until 2003. And so really, we've only had 20 years to talk about this. But that's 20 years. That's more than a generation. We need to get this into people's minds. And so by giving people the information about queer history, it's not going to turn them queer. It won't make anybody queer. You can't make somebody queer. They are born queer or they're not. And so we all need this information because we need to stop the cruelty that's happening all over the world. And only education can do that. Common sense and education. So they're my 2 episodes. I don't think I could do another one anytime soon, because they've just made me so upset and so angry. There have been times when I've read so many things and had to step away from the computer and just rant at Ken, because it hurts. These are my brothers and sisters throughout history, and I know how bad things are now, but it's just really disgusting how much Christianity hurt our community. And for what? But there we are. So that was episode 22. There are more episodes if you want to subscribe to Refracted World Plus. It's £3 a month. And there are more episodes there if you want to listen to more. There is also merch if you want to buy t-shirts and things. And if you do want to buy anything, I've got about 9 t-shirts now. I just can't stop buying them. They're brilliant. I'm really bad at sales, but I'm determined to talk about it at the end of every episode just in case somebody wants them, because if you do want merch, please use this code podcast20. It will get you 20% off everything in the store. And it just means I make 52p per t-shirt with the code being used. So I'm not doing this for money. I'm doing it because I want to get my designs out there, really. And if you buy Refracted World merch and somebody sees it, they might go, oh, what's that? And then get more people to listen to the podcast. So it's all advertising in a way, I guess. But yeah, and the t-shirt's great quality. I'm not actually wearing one today. I just looked down. I'm not. But yeah, they're great. And I'm going to just keep designing and buying them myself, whatever happens. So if nobody wants to buy them, that's fine. I'll just keep wearing them myself because I love them. And yeah, thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening. And I really do hope you learned something. And like I said, please, even if you don't share the episode, please just at least talk about it with people and just get that message out there. And yeah, until the next episode, I will be back and talking about something. I haven't written the next episode, so I don't know what it is yet, but I'm sure it'll be absolutely fabulous. I hope you join me for it, and yeah, take care of yourselves, and I'll be back next week. Bye.